My name is Elizabeth Palmer, and I'm a foreign correspondent for CBS News, and I'll be the moderator this evening. I'll begin by introducing our guests. On my extreme right is Dr. John Swire, Jim Swire, whose daughter Flora died in the Lockerbie Pan Am air crash. On my near right is Oliver Miles, who was Britain's ambassador to Libya until 1984 and is now the chairman of MEC International. And on my left is Gareth Peirce, who is a human rights lawyer. I won't go into the deep history of the Pan Am crash because I'm sure you all know it. What is relevant is that the only individual, the only person convicted for the bomb that brought that plane down was Mr. Megrahi, who was released from a Scottish jail on compassionate grounds about 3 weeks ago and is now back in Libya. The appeal that he had originally wanted was cancelled in order to allow him to go back to Libya, and many people have argued that the appeal hearing would have revealed facts that have long been obscure with respect to this case, and perhaps even expose the fact that a gross miscarriage of justice was committed when he was incarcerated. The question that we're going to try and get at tonight is what is the case for a public inquiry into the Pan Am Lockerbie crash? I am going to ask each of our guests to address you for 5 minutes at the beginning to tell you a little bit about themselves and their view of everything that's happened since that terrible day in 1988. And then we'll throw the discussion to you on the floor for questions, and we'll just see where that takes us. So, Dr. Swire, if you'd like to begin, I invite you to address our audience.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm Dr. Jim Swire, and we were fortunate enough to have 3 lovely children, of whom the eldest was Flora, who was a top-flight doctor who was just in the process of graduating at the age of 23 when her life was taken away over Lockerbie. And I was educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, and when the gruesome task came of going through Flora's room after Lockerbie, we found on her desk a letter from Cambridge University accepting her to do postgraduate work there. And it was clear that she had been intending to ring me up on Christmas Day to tell me the news which she knew would be exciting to me, that Cambridge had accepted her. After her murder, I came to hope that justice would deliver answers to the question of who had murdered her. I accepted the restrictions placed on me by the necessary run-up to a judicial verdict, namely the criminal investigation, which soon became a burden which was preventing us from asking a lot of questions. And our main interest lies down really in London. Why was it that the British government of the day, which was of course run by Mrs. Thatcher, Lady Thatcher, which had received many timely and appropriate warnings, did nothing to protect that flight? Why was it that our fatal accident inquiry in 1990-91 found that the disaster was preventable? Why was it that the fact that a break-in in the early hours of the disaster was concealed from the court in Holland until after the verdict had been reached, and from our fatal accident inquiry in Scotland in 1990? And that concealment led us to feel that the government of the day must have known a great deal more than was being allowed to become public. We fought for the wording of every single one of the warnings that we discovered. We received a rebuff from every single Prime Minister from Margaret Thatcher onwards. Margaret Thatcher wouldn't even meet us to discuss an inquiry. And I hope that what you hear tonight will convince you that there is a burning and desperate need for an inquiry, because it's my personal belief that the trial of Abdelbaset Ali Mohmed went terribly wrong and that he should never have been convicted. And as many of you from the media, I have to say that the spectacle of media people climbing over each other to try to exploit party differences over Lockerbie seems to me quite demeaning and the whole question of dwelling upon the exact reasons for him being sent home to Tripoli, a move, incidentally, of which I strongly approve because I don't believe he was guilty, and I don't think he should ever have been in prison in the first place. I hope that now discussions can move on to a different sphere. I attended a meeting of the Scottish Parliament, which I heard them all discussing which party had done what in terms of releasing this man. I heard only two small voices amongst the MSPs raise the question of, was this man guilty? And that is a question which, until it's resolved, remains a major stumbling block for those of us who want to get to the truth behind why this disaster ever happened in the first place, who was behind it, and what the role of government was in the failure to prevent it.
I wonder if it might be productive as a last statement from each of you, if you feel it's appropriate, to say what you think, who was behind it. Who do you personally think was behind it?
In July 1988, that's about 5 months before Lockerbie, the American missile cruiser, the Vincennes, shot down an Iranian Airbus with the resulting death of 290 pilgrims. When the vessel got back to America, the captain, Captain Rogers, was awarded a medal for meritorious service. Iran swore briefly that she would get her revenge. I believe that she got it at Lockerbie. I believe that she used technology belonging to a Syrian group called the PFLP-GC, and indeed it was the definition of the technology belonging to that group which I heard in the court at Zeist, which convinced me that Megrahi had nothing to do with Lockerbie, because the devices that that group had were designed in such a way that they were stable indefinitely at ground level. You could put them in this building and leave them there for a month and nothing would happen. But if you put them in an aeroplane without any intervention whatsoever, even if they were inside a suitcase, they would always explode around 40 minutes after the plane's wheels left the tarmac. The Lockerbie plane flew for 38 minutes. There was a break-in the early hours of that day into Heathrow Airport. And as they say in America, I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swire. Mr. Miles, over to you.
Okay, my name's Oliver Miles. I was rather briefly British ambassador in Libya in 1984, briefly because I had the task of breaking off diplomatic relations when the Libyans murdered WPC Yvonne Fletcher outside the Embassy People's Bureau in London here. I'd been to Libya a couple of times before that because I was a career Foreign Office official. I'd been working as head of the department dealing with North Africa, among other things, and I went to Libya twice in the preceding years to try to get to grips with the problems we had with Libya, particularly the tendency to murder Libyan opposition figures in London, which we thought was untidy. After the breach in relations, I had nothing much more to do with Libya in my career in the diplomatic service. I retired in 1996. In 1999, coincidentally the year that diplomatic relations were restored with Libya, I went back to Libya first as a tourist, then involved in business, taking missions of businessmen and investors, potential investors, into Libya. And for the last 10 years, I've been going there fairly regularly, probably two or three times a year. I was last there in May. So I'm not an expert at all on the Lockerbie affair. I don't have any inside story on Lockerbie. I was, of course, observed it, as so many other people did, from outside. I've tried to keep up with the story and to form my own views. And hence, in this last month or so, when there's been this intense media interest arising from the question of Megrahi's potential return to Libya and so on, I've been very much involved in trying to explain my understanding of what happened, talking about those issues like, was there a deal, was it all about oil, was it all about money, and so on, which I'm very happy to pick up here if you want. I personally think, briefly, that there was a deal, but that it wasn't about oil and money. Coming to the question you asked us to address, I'm afraid I'm an agnostic. I can't go along with Jim Swire in his confidence that Libya and Abdelbaset Ali Mohmed were innocent. I simply don't know. Moreover, Much as I sympathise with the wish of Dr. Swire and others to get the truth of the matter, I have no confidence that a public inquiry will get to the truth. I'm sure that they would uncover quite a lot of interesting stories about what went wrong with the trial, and probably a lot of dirty washing would be washed in public, and that may or may not be a good thing depending on your point of view. But I don't think they would get to the truth. The fact is, I don't believe anybody knows the truth except whoever did it. And my only real hope that the truth will come out is that there might one day be a deathbed confession.
And the deal you referred to is the deal that led to Megrahi's release, is it?
Yes, that's right. That's right. There's an unanswered question, which is why did Megrahi abandon his appeal?
What do you think?
I think that he was lent on in some way, but I can't be quite sure how or who by. I'm very happy to talk about that more.
Or for what reason?
Oh, for what reason? I think because both the British and the Scottish authorities didn't want all this dirty linen to be washed in public. And so an appeal could have been very embarrassing. And don't forget that, although I'm not a lawyer, still less a Scottish lawyer, I understand that in Scottish law, if the appeal had not been discontinued, which it was, and it's not clear why it was discontinued, it would have been open to Megrahi's heirs to continue it after his death. So there would have been a serious appeal had he not decided to withdraw it.
Thank you very much. Gareth Peirce, human rights lawyer, over to you.
The first thing I would say is not to do with law at all. My son was a medical student in 1988, and the brightest and most beautiful student in his year was Flora Swire. And she went off at Christmas to join her boyfriend in America, in New York. And as I've learned from reading about Lockerbie, she didn't expect to get a seat on the Pan Am flight, which was usually crowded. But because of warnings of which she had been told nothing, and no member of the public had been told anything, it was easy to get a seat on that plane. Now, there is an enormous amount of information about the circumstances of the destruction of Pan Am 103. But in the context of prosecuting Mr. al-Megrahi, none of it, in fact, makes sense. Up to a point in September 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Up to that point, there was obviously being constructed a prosecution of someone totally different who had nothing to do with Libya. And that was a member of the Syrian-backed group that Dr. Swire has referred to. The group having been arrested in Germany in possession of barometric timed bombs constructed in exactly the same Toshiba cassette recorder, of which the leader of the group said 5 had been constructed and 1 was missing and never recovered. That was shortly before Lockerbie. And a member of that group had been arrested in Sweden, who was found to have travelled to Malta, and he had in his possession clothes bought in Malta, and there was a Maltese shopkeeper who saw his picture in the newspaper and said to his brother, "That's the man who bought the clothes from my shop." The clothes having been traced from debris from the wreckage to a suitcase in which the Toshiba bomb had exploded. But there was a forensic investigative trail that was leading to that group, a group that put itself out for hire at the time to state sponsors of terrorism. And there was a prosecution prepared that was about to indict that man at least, and probably other members of that group for Lockerbie. And then Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq, and the prosecution switched. It switched to Libya because the West needed cheap oil, and it needed relationships with states it had not thought it needed relationships before. And the prosecution switched, so that in 1991 there was an announcement that 2 Libyan airline officials in Malta were to be prosecuted. Now, it's a complex tale. It's a complex tale that might never have a solution. But just because it may never have a solution, it doesn't mean any trial will do, and that it doesn't matter what trial, so long as there's a trial. And that, I think, is what anyone who digs into the evidence can see that the trial of al-Megrahi was all about. It's suited to prosecute Libya, and it suited Gaddafi to hand over 2 employees. What did he expect? One doesn't know. Did he expect they both be acquitted? But he handed them over. What is shocking is that we have the knowledge that said, never again do we prosecute people on bad science, and never again do we prosecute people on rotten identification, after we had had wrongful conviction after wrongful conviction exposed in this country, all of which took place in the 70s and 80s. And if you look at the cast of characters responsible for the science in Lockerbie, they were all there. They were all there in all those miscarriages of justice, the same people. We absolutely can't tonight go into the detail. I'll simply summarize it by saying the science was not reliable, and the identification, where the man in Sweden had been picked out by the Maltese shopkeeper and then switched for it to become an identification by him of another man, al-Megrahi. That's a breach of every safeguard we have against a wrongful conviction. So what one can say as an observer, and what the UN observer said, who sat throughout the trial, was appointed by the UN to report on the trial, he said it was a disgrace. He said the whole court was contaminated by international politics. The whole verdict depended on witnesses who were either unreliable at best or who were lying at worst. And therefore, if we're looking at Lockerbie, I think if it was ever right to look at wrongful convictions in the past, see, were they wrong? How had they happened? Lockerbie is a case that is screaming out for looking at, because there is a disgraceful atmosphere of pushing and pulling and international politics and making the evidence fit that. And that's why, if there is a will for it, there should be a way.
Thank you very much. I won't ask you as a lawyer to say who you think did it. I mean, I understand that, well, perhaps you'd like to say the Syrian group was for hire. Who was the hirer?
The thesis that was adopted, not by us, by the prosecutors, that was being developed, was clearly an Iran-backed group for hire revenge. Who knows? Maybe that wasn't right. Maybe it's not true. But how can a developed thesis conveniently switch to something else? And retain the certainty that the new story is true. If there's anything that one can hang on to here, it's saying we have standards, and the standards require certainty, and they require absolute safeguards, and all of these were violated.
I guess one of the questions that springs to my mind as a journalist immediately is, in order to believe that an enormous miscarriage of justice was committed, you have to believe that a chunk of the most illustrious of Scottish jurists and lawyers were somehow complicit and either guilty of negligence or collusion. And I would like in the questions to get to that, but I think that you have all stated very interesting and not necessarily accordant positions, which is a very good jumping off point for our questions. So let's begin with questions from the floor. If you would stand up and introduce yourselves clearly for the cameras and for the webcast, that would help the broadcast in general. Who would like to be first? I can't believe it. We've got a...
I'm Jennifer Glass. I'm a journalist. I'm curious as who had put together this prosecution that you were talking about, Gareth. That's my question to you. And is it accessible under the Freedom of Information Act?
Well, there is a prosecuting body. The Crown prosecutors prosecute on behalf of the people of Scotland. That's how the prosecution was brought. That means there are police, the Dumfriesshire police, the smallest police force in Britain, in fact, who maybe left to their own devices would have come up with a more trustworthy solution. But in a number of ways, their investigation was hijacked from outside, or they relied upon investigators who perhaps were not reliable. One was RADI, the Royal Armaments Research and Development Establishment in London, which was the establishment that led to the wrongful conviction of the Maguires, Giuseppe Conlon, Judith Ward, Danny McNamee. There's a very long list here, shamefully. That was one aspect of the investigation. The other aspect was the FBI, an investigator called Thomas Thurman, who was disgraced, and an investigation debarred him from ever going into an FBI lab again. He was key to the case. And there was a CIA investigator brought in called Vincent Canestraro, whose claim to fame was that he had written the script for a policy on Libya for Ronald Reagan, which led to the bombing of Tripoli by America. A footnote from Mrs. Thatcher's memoirs, which Dr. Swire has quoted, is that she has written, I have to confess I haven't read her memoirs, but if it's right, she wrote that after the bombing of Tripoli, Gaddafi's house, in the 1980s, Libya was never involved in terrorist activity again. Now, memories play tricks, but perhaps she's right. Perhaps she was just forgetting who was meant to have perpetrated Lockerbie in 1988.
Yeah,
I'd like to...
Could you add to that, what she wrote, I think page 495, sounds a bit obsessional to know the page number, but she wrote that Gaddafi had not been destroyed, but he was humbled, and never again could he mount a major terrorist attack. So when I read this, 2 years after the two Libyans had been indicted, I wrote to her and I said, how can you write this when your government have been telling us for 2 years? that it was the Libyans who'd murdered our families, and I got a letter back saying she had nothing to add to the text.
Perhaps I could just add to that, although it's not actually a terrorist action, that it was after the bombing of Tripoli and Libya by the Americans using our air bases that Gaddafi gave Semtex to the IRA, which was the most damaging thing he's ever done to this country.
I'd like to ask you, Dr. Swire, what is the most important piece of hidden information, in your view, that would emerge from a public inquiry? Some of the guilty or some of those who perhaps haven't behaved in the most exemplary fashion are dead or retired. In other words, it's deep history now, 1988. What relevant things would come out of an inquiry?
Well, I think we can be proud of the fact that the English relatives group have always looked for how they could possibly force something good to come out of something as evil as the Lockerbie atrocity was. And one of the ways we might be able to do that would be to see improved trade relations between the countries, which would diminish the chances of further terrorist action if indeed this had anything to do with Libyan terrorism, as I don't now believe that it did. But to see improved commercial relations would be a good thing for the people of Libya, which is about 5 million people, and the people of Scotland, which again is about 5 million. Libya has pots of money. The Scots have, when they're sober, plenty of well-trained people who could go and make Libya work better. So it seems an obvious exchange would be the benefit of part of the human race, and that would be a good thing. But there are so many loose ends that would be worthwhile tidying up. Now, one of those is that the same international observer appointed by the United Nations, Professor Hans Kochler, actually has said in public that the only way this verdict could have been reached against Megrahi would be by deliberate malpractice on the part of Scotland's Crown Office. Now, I have watched that Crown Office in action. I have asked them if they knew about the break-in at Heathrow during the 12 years when it lay concealed, and they've replied that they do not, and I find it they did not, and I find it very difficult to accept that at face value, and I would like an inquiry to see whether that could be corroborated or not. But I do think that also, having watched them at work in the first tranche of Megrahi's appeal, now unfortunately stopped, they were employing deliberate delaying tactics which caused a lot of Scottish lawyers to come up to me in the foyer of that court and say that they'd never seen anything so disgraceful in their professional lives as the way the Crown Office were deliberately delaying progress in the second appeal. And that, of course, leads straight on to the question, why would the Crown Office be so determined that that appeal should not progress?
Well, let me ask you, how many people, let's just say they were all trying to hide that piece of information, how many people would have had to have colluded?
Would have had to?
Colluded. Colluded.
I can't possibly answer your question. What I can tell you is that I watched them in action throughout the trial of Zeist. Myself and one other British relative were the only two relatives who were there throughout the trial. And every evening in the relatives' lounge, set apart for the use of the relatives, there used to be a flotilla of American relatives going through. They didn't usually stay more than a couple of weeks because that was funded by the Department of Justice, and they would chop and change every couple of weeks. But every evening during the trial, there was a group who would come into the relatives' lounge, and that group was composed partly of Crown Office representatives. I'm not going to name any names tonight. And the other part was composed of representatives of the US Department of Justice. And the action that we observed there was that that group was indoctrinating, for want of a better word, the relatives present into believing that everything had gone swimmingly that day in court. The evidence was all above criticism, and the verdict, when it eventually came, would be unimpeachable. And that went on throughout the trial. Call it indoctrination, call it grooming, call it what you like. I think it underlies a good deal of the reason, and I want to be specific about this. I don't want anybody to attack the American relatives just because a lot of vitriol has come out of America, not just against me, but against our country as well, on the grounds that we were, helping the cause of terrorism by letting Megrahi go and so on. Nobody amongst them is asking the question, was that man guilty? And that's the question that the huge media furore over his handover is skirting around and not addressing. And it's very important to us because if the verdict can be overturned, then the people who are responsible for the lives of all those lovely people, those 270 victims, will be naked in front of the questions that we shall be asking.
I'd like to know why, if your theory is correct and the Vincennes shooting down the Iranian airliner was in fact the incident that provoked the Lockerbie bombing, why did Libya then accept responsibility? Why did Mr. Megrahi go quietly? Why did he never speak at his own trial in his own defense?
I think Oliver Miles might be better at answering this than me, but you should really read the letter which Libya sent to the United Nations. She had to accept responsibility for the disaster as well as paying lots of so-called compensation. Believe you me, there is no compensation for losing a child. But the letter actually said, because a Scottish court has found our, where's the effect of it, it's not actually verbatim, but because a Scottish court has found our intelligence agent guilty of this crime, therefore we, that's the Libyan regime, must assume responsibility for the consequences of what he was found to have done. What will happen if the verdict is overturned? I have no idea, but it's very interesting to see what does happen. But to answer your question in a different way, I think what Colonel Gaddafi wanted was to be returned to the more normal community of nations. A dictator depends very largely on the success of his economy, usually, I believe. I think his oil industry was getting a bit in the doldrums for want of spare parts and modern, up-to-date technology from the West. He wanted to put that right. There was also pressure on him, of course, about his alleged development of potentially of nuclear weapons and stuff. But he wanted to come back into the fold, as it were. And I feel, even if his regime did play a part in this, and I don't know whether they did, I have no evidence that they did. I'm convinced that his intelligence agent didn't. But even if they did, I think that the way forward is to encourage good relations. And that was one of the reasons that I went to see him immediately after the indictments were issued against his two agents, in order to encourage him to allow them to come to trial under what in those days I believe would be the very fair Scottish criminal system.
But to uncover the truth would basically expose Libya would reveal Libya to have lied about the commission of an extraordinary crime and to have handed over one of its citizens to be the fall guy.
No, that's not quite right. I mean, I think what you said, Jim, is absolutely right. But I think that the Libyans, that Gaddafi and his people, but let's say Gaddafi himself, made the calculation that the situation they were in was intolerable. UN sanctions were not comprehensive. They weren't destroying the country, but they were holding it back. He felt insecure because the Cold War balance of power, so-called balance of power between Washington and Moscow no longer existed. He felt exposed. He wanted to come in from the cold. And he calculated that it was worth an awful lot of money to do that. As a matter of fact, his Prime Minister said this in England quite bluntly about 5 years ago when he was on a visit here. He said, "We paid it to get you off our backs. We paid it for the sake of peace." And people were very shocked and said, but surely you were guilty, to which the Libyans have always said, no, we weren't. We were not guilty. Now, you also asked the question, how did they persuade, or why did they give up these two agents to be tried? I've been thinking about that a lot during the recent media frenzy about the return of Megrahi and so on. I think it's a very important question. Either they said to Megrahi, look, you did a good job bringing that aeroplane down, and I'm afraid there's one more job we'd like you to do, which is to go to a very cold and wet island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and die there. Or they said to him, we know you're innocent, you know you're innocent, we trust Scottish justice, we think it will work, we'll get you off. Which do you find more plausible?
Well, that takes us back to the question I asked you. How many Scottish legal luminaries then had to collude in either willful blindness or negligence?
I don't know the answer to that. I would think it's in single figures. That's a guess. Speculation, if you like.
Now, let me throw out throw it over to you. Is anybody from the floor aching to ask a question at this stage? Yes, the lady at the back, and then we'll come to you, sir. Yeah.
I don't have so much a question. It's just I'm a journalist. My name's Melanie McFadden. Is to say.
Could you just speak up your name?
Sorry, my name's Melanie McFadden, and I'm a freelance journalist. I had the privilege of interviewing Jim recently, and doing the background to that, I vaguely remembered that Paul Foote had written something very comprehensive in 2002 about the trial, and I went back and found it. In fact, Private Eye are selling it for £5, which is a bit of a disgrace because they should be giving it away. But it should be. They are giving it away now. It should be required reading for everybody, because if you have everything that's been said tonight, or almost everything that's been said tonight, is in that very, very comprehensive, very thorough investigation. And if anybody is not convinced that Megrahi didn't do it, have I got that the way? Yes. They should read that. They should read it anyway, because it gives you an absolutely comprehensive, not just a comment, but an investigation based on the absolute facts as they exist and are out there for us, to say what actually happened at Lockerbie, and how the state set up the picture that it was the PFLP-GC, and how they changed horses midstream and suddenly Libya was in the frame. And it also is an example to those journalists among us here tonight that we do not go around calling Megrahi the Lockerbie bomber, because ever since the whole mess, the whole thing has blown up, he's been referred to time and time and time again as the Lockerbie bomber. He is not the Lockerbie bomber.
Well, that's what the courts decided, and that's the convention in journalism, and it's responsible. If the courts decide it, then that's what we accept.
My argument is that this has crept in as comment. And my argument is that in the comment that's been made by all kinds of journalists making all kinds of comment columns, that they haven't done the work. They haven't read the background. If they'd read the background, they might at least have put in the phrase so-called. Because once you've looked at what is out there, what is comprehensive, what isn't just some slapdash stuff pulled off a wire or some cutting without any thought, it is absolutely clear that there's been a miscarriage. There's very, very likely there's been a miscarriage of justice, and that we're all just knee-jerkingly going along with it and calling him the Lockerbie bomber.
At the very least, he was complicit, though, in that
Have you read
verdict.
Have you read Paul Foote's investigation?
Yes, I have, some time ago. But I have never understood why he didn't come to his own defense better. Yeah. And maybe we can talk about that now, because he wasn't his own best friend.
We're talking about Megrahi here. He was instructed by his defense team not to say anything in court. So they told me. So the defense team told me.
Do you have anything to add to that?
No, as I said, I think I'm surrounded by people who know more about the Lockerbie trial than I do.
Who was his defense team?
Sorry?
Who was his defense team?
Well, there were two people who were allegedly involved in doing this, two Libyans allegedly involved. And the first Libyan, Ali Khalifa Fima, was represented by a gentleman called Richard Keane. Richard Keane had a very intense and intelligent grasp of the evidence that was laid in front of him. He understood, for instance, the technology of the devices which were available from the Syrian group we've been talking about, which I don't honestly think any other lawyer in the court did. And for instance, when the first appeal was heard at Zeist, by that time, after the verdict against Megrahi had been reached, Fahima, meantime, had been acquitted, thanks to Richard Keane's advocacy on his behalf. In the first appeal, the question about the Heathrow break-in was known, and Keane realized that the devices that were available were inert at ground level, and therefore were perfect for having been introduced in the early morning of the disaster day. But he, I think, was the only one who did, because during the first appeal, one of their lordships actually said, well, the break-in was a bit of a long time before the explosion occurred, wasn't it? And Megrahi's QC, Mr. Taylor, didn't raise a question about that comment. Extraordinary. And yet, the main court, in which Taylor had also been representing Megrahi, had heard full details from a highly competent senior German forensic officer about how these devices worked and how they required no human intervention at all. All they had to do was get them into a plane. If you could do that, they would always explode, even if they'd been lying around for days or weeks, always explode around 40 minutes later. and my daughter's plane exploded 38 minutes after taking off from the Heathrow tarmac. And that was such an important point. And it was the understanding of that technology that really converted me from believing that I was going to see the guilty parties brought to justice to believing they were nothing to do with it. Because it seemed to me, I'm sure most of you have heard of a chap called William of Ockham. Perhaps you haven't, you're all looking rather blank. Chap, I think he lived in the Middle Ages, and he had this very simple theory, which is usually interpreted to mean that the simplest explanation that satisfies all the relevant aspects of a case is the most likely to be true. And I put it to you that a nation which had so strong a motivation as Iran had, and was a frequent dealer with an organization which had devices as I've just described, and in a scenario where our major airport was broken into in the early morning of the day of the disaster, offering a perfect opportunity for use of one of those devices, particularly as a sideline, remembering that Iran Air's facility at Heathrow in those days was adjacent to where the break-in had occurred. I think you might suggest that Ockham's philosophy would best be met by believing that maybe the Heathrow break-in had something to do with the Lockerbie disaster, rather than the scenario at Malta, where their lordships were reduced to saying it was a major difficulty for the prosecution case, that the prosecution had no evidence to lead as to how al-Megrahi was supposed to have penetrated security at the Malta airport. If they had had to balance those two, I think the trial would have had to be stopped. They couldn't do that because the main court didn't know about the about the Heathrow break-in. And I have had a letter back from the Lord Advocate now. I asked her whether the Crown Office knew about the Heathrow evidence during the 12 years where nobody else seems to have known about it, and they replied they did not know, as I've said before, and I think that requires corroboration, because I think it's a terribly important point. If it can be shown to be untrue, then I think the whole rotten egg bursts open, and it's clear then that there was gross political interference, if that can be shown.
Yes, we're going to come to another question in a moment, but Gareth has something to add.
Just
carry on.
On your point that if he was innocent, why didn't he say something? It happens every day in trials that barristers say, leave it to me. There's no case. We can get it thrown out. My closing speech will be magnificent and we'll get you off. And they're wrong. They're wrong again and again and again, but it's the arrogance of lawyers, and lawyers who don't get to know the people they represent and don't have confidence that a person who is perfectly capable of saying 1,000,000 times better than the lawyer what their position is. Lawyers are very dangerous creatures in trials, very dangerous. And I think it's quite wrong to think that al-Megrahi, who would know nothing about a trial in a Scottish court, would have the ability to make the right decisions. The second thing I'd say is, I went out of interest for one day to the trial in The Hague, and for particular reasons, the man who was suspected of involvement, who was about to be prosecuted before they switched to Libya, Abu Talib, had been called as a witness for the prosecution. The reason he'd been called then was because they wanted to spike the guns of the defense, believing that was the defense thesis, that it was Abu Talib and his group that did it. And I came into the trial without the comprehensive knowledge that Dr. Swire would have. And as a defense lawyer, sat there aghast that this man was being cross-examined, was not being warned about self-incrimination, was told when he said, "Do I have to answer questions?" "You do." And to my eye and ear, everything he was saying was equivalent to being a confession of involvement in the crime. It was the most extraordinary experience, that everything that was put to him, his travels to Malta, his clothes that matched up, his identification by the Maltese shopkeeper, his affiliation with the group, the fact that he had a barometer at his home from which the switch was missing. It was an extraordinary affair. And therefore, perhaps if I had been al-Megrahi and his lawyers, I might have sat there thinking, we don't have a problem.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. You have a question. You, sir, have a question. You'll be next.
Thank you. My name is Kate Adey. I'm interested about where you go from here. The reason is that, and I have to admit this, I have had a connection to this event for quite a long time. I may not be the only person in the room who interviewed both Megrahi and Elfima before they were sent to this country. I met their families, I spoke to their lawyers, and I also spoke to Libyan officials involved in sending them, as well as Colonel Gaddafi. I'm no expert on the trial, and I've followed things closely. But after all of these years, one thing strikes me at this moment, that there are four, let us say, two governments, the American and the British, a parliament in Scotland and its judicial system, and the regime in Libya. Four powerful seats of influence, power, knowledge, and involvement in this. From looking at all I have understood in the past few years, all four have good reason for endorsing the status quo. Very good reason. They're all different reasons as well. I then ask everybody here, but also particularly a human rights lawyer and a diplomat and a campaigner, where do you start to change something, to cause something to happen, when there are four hugely powerful elements in this, all of which are dead set officially against any investigation? And it would seem that the door legally closed after an interview in a prison cell with Megrahi a few weeks ago. What do you do? People talk about public inquiries, they talk about investigations. Who are we talking about? I mean, I genuinely am curious to know how you mount this kind of action, because there have been enough questions raised over the years. Where do you start? Who is going to do it? And where's the vehicle for it?
Thank you, Kate. Shall we ask Dr. Swire to begin?
Okay.
And each of you can
When I heard about Megrahi having withdrawn his appeal, I was astonished, because the last time I met him was just before Christmas last year, and he was as adamant as ever then that he wanted to clear his name before he went home. By the time his appeal was withdrawn, of course, he had come to realize how close to death he was getting, and I'm not qualified to say who may have pressurized him or who may not. But by removing his appeal from the scene, I think he has left the Scots in a position where they are confronted by loose ends which they must address. For instance, their own Criminal Case Review Commission found that this may well have been a miscarriage of justice. There is the extraordinary criticism coming in from outside, from the UN's International Observer. I think they need to launch some kind of an inquiry at that end. I have suggested that in view of our moderator's nationality today, I have suggested that such an inquiry should not be led by a Scot, because the vitriol that came out of America when Megrahi was allowed to go home would mean, I think, that a purely Scottish inquiry would carry very little weight. And I suggested that perhaps General de Chastelain, who has a high reputation in this country for his sorting out of IRA arms, and comes from a country, Canada, which is widely seen as being impartial in this sort of situation, might be a suitable head for such an inquiry. I met Alex Salmond last week, and he maintains that he believes in the verdict against Megrahi, but he has, as he promised, made some effort to unleash some of the information held by the Scottish Criminal Case Review Commission into the public domain. And also the defence lawyers in the past have told me they're confident that they have sufficient information to prove that Megrahi was not the buyer of the clothes, which is what led the whole police chase to Malta in the first place. So if that comes into the public domain, as I have reason to believe it may do in the next few weeks, that will mean that we will be able to be much more critical of this verdict. And I think I have to say something else, that this is called the Frontline Club. I wonder where all our really intensive investigative journalists have gone. There's been a little ding-dong about describing Megrahi as the man responsible for the Lockerbie disaster. Could we not spare 1.5 column inches to say the man found guilty of the Lockerbie disaster? I would go along with that. That's true. He's found guilty. I don't believe he is guilty, but that doesn't matter what I think. We need to address the verdict and see if we can overturn it. So a Scottish inquiry would be one way. Then there's Gordon Brown. I've written to Gordon Brown recently to ask for an inquiry, and I do see a possibility that he might have a slight motivation to grant one because of the vitriol that he is having poured down the back of his shirt collar from America and elsewhere. And he could, of course, get rid of all that. If he could prove that Megrahi, in fact, wasn't guilty at all, then Scotland could put a hand up, so sorry, we got it wrong, sorry chaps, he wasn't guilty after all. And then the Americans could no longer say things like Brown and Salmond are furthering the causes of terrorism by allowing this man to go home. So it's just possible that he might think he had some motivation for wanting to overturn the verdict. That's another way. Then there's the question of human rights, a corridor which we've hardly begun to look at yet, but I hope for very considerable help from Gareth here. There's the question of whether we could sue Heathrow Airport. You can have little idea how angry it makes me to think that Heathrow Airport knew from their night security log that night, or rather the very early morning of the day of the disaster, they knew they'd been broken into. They didn't know who'd broken in. They didn't know why it'd broken in. They had been passed some of the warnings the British government had received, which indicated to them that there was a higher than usual risk of terrorist attack against civil aviation. And yet they did nothing, absolutely nothing. They didn't stop any flights. If they had behaved in a way that I think was responsible, my daughter might still be alive, and I wouldn't be having to talk to you guys now. So I really think there is a massive question for Heathrow to answer. Whether that can be done this long after the event, I have as yet no idea. But litigation of that sort is another possibility. Human rights litigation is certainly a possibility in either England, Scotland, or both. An inquiry in England or Scotland are both possibilities. And finally, we are working on the possibility of sending a letter requesting the General Assembly of the United Nations to look into Lockerbie. On previous occasions, the Security Council did have it as a matter about which, as the jargon goes, they were seized, and they are no longer apparently seized about it. But if we were to ask the Security Council to look into it, I'm sure that somehow it would get blocked by vetoes from Britain and America, and then they would seize it again for years and nothing would happen, and the General Assembly wouldn't be able to act. So we are thinking, in fact we are preparing a tract for submission to the General Assembly of the United Nations. There are some of the ideas. The world has become totally different the moment Megrahi withdrew his appeal. I don't wish to dwell on why he withdrew it. I believe, personally, having met him and had a long talk with him, that Kenny McCaskill did what he thought was right for the right reasons. People snigger when you say that about a politician, but I think it's good to look for good in everybody, and that's what I think about McCaskill's decision. Perhaps I'm wrong, I don't know. But there are some of the ideas that are going through our minds at the moment.
Mr. Miles.
Well, I agree with almost all of the things that Jim Swire has said, and I can understand why he feels so strongly about them, and I think that there is indeed a role here for some investigative journalists to get cracking and try and dig some dirt. But I don't think it's going to answer Kate Adie's question, which is where do we go from here? At risk of repeating myself, I said this in my introductory piece, I don't see an inquiry uncovering the truth, for the simple reason that I don't think anybody who would come before the inquiry would know the truth. I think that the truth is hidden from us at the moment and probably will remain hidden from us, and I think we have to face that fact. It may perhaps be revealed by a deathbed confession, but I don't believe that an inquiry into the facts of Lockerbie, going over the evidence again after the evidence has been tampered with by any number of different intelligence services and police forces and so on, I don't think that they've got a hope in hell of finding the truth. And I think it would be, although I see the need for the truth about the trial, the truth about Megrahi to be uncovered if it possibly can be, I think that there's a modern tendency to think that whenever you have a great big problem, the best thing to do is to have a great big inquiry, and I'm not so sure about it. We're just about to launch into a great big inquiry about the Iraq War. We all know what happened in the Iraq War. We don't need an inquiry to tell us. And I'm afraid that it's the other way around with Lockerbie. We want to know what happened in Lockerbie, but an inquiry is not going to tell us.
Gareth?
Well, in some ways, there has been an inquiry for nearly 20 years, and that's Dr. Swire and the relatives. They've been conducting their own inquiry, and they've dug deep, and they've learned enough forensic science to know if what was being perpetrated at the trial was a 3-card trick, and they've done a pretty good job in educating the rest of us. So there's been an inquiry, but they shouldn't have had to do it, and they deserve better. Now, sometimes extraordinary turnabouts happen when the degree of embarrassment outweighs everything else, and if it becomes more embarrassing to Scottish executive or British executive not to have an inquiry than to have one. That's how inquiries come about. It's a way, as Oliver Miles was saying, of thinking, well, we can whitewash this one, and you never know what will come out. There is the European Convention of Human Rights, to which we're signatory. Article 2 guarantees the right to life, and as part of that guarantee, it guarantees to those who have had someone die the right to an effective public investigation, effective in that it will lead to an identification of the perpetrator. Now, there's something in that for us, and they haven't had that. And somewhere along the line, if you find out that you have a legal right to something that no one's ever thought that you would exercise, that's a way of articulating. We're looking at ways of articulating what's morally wrong to make it legally wrong. And so they've had legal wrongs done to them, the families, as well as every other kind of wrong. There will always be the possibility of a whistleblower, unlikely in this country where it's a crime, whereas it's a protected species in America, whistleblowing. I'm not sure that anyone could possibly have an answer to the ability to move mountains, but we should bear in mind that some extraordinary things have happened in the past 8 years in which governments have been complicit. Rendition, torture, trading bodies from country to country, the purposes of unlawfully extracting information from them. And it didn't remain hidden. And it is coming more and more to light, the ugliness of it. We shouldn't forget that. And we shouldn't forget, for instance, that a key trigger for the Iraq War was the confession by a Libyan, Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who was waterboarded, whatever it was, 25, 30 times to talk about the link between al-Qaeda and Iraq. And it was all untrue, and it was all in the dark, and it was all never to be known, and it's known. And therefore, yes, the same players and many more played that game. But it isn't a game they've won lock, set, and game, set and match, lock, stock and barrel. They haven't won. In the end, they're losing and they will have lost. And so the answer may not be a good old British inquiry with a good old British judge, may not be, may take some other form. But the relatives deserve a proper inquiry with a small I or a large I. They deserve it, and they shouldn't have to do it themselves anymore.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have 3 questions now. First you, sir.
My name is Hazem Rafai. It has been mentioned several times during this presentation about the early warnings prior to the Lockerbie. It was sufficient to they were important to the degree that there has been a reference that the plane, some seats have been left empty in the plane. So I think what would be interesting to know is whether this was a failure of handling warning at a primary level, or were these warnings escalated to a much senior or political level? Thank you.
Would you like to handle that?
Thank you very much. We know now 14 explicit warnings that were received by the British government before Lockerbie happened. And perhaps the most interesting one to look at is one that came from German intelligence, which described in great detail these same bombs that I've been talking about earlier on. And they were looked at by the British Department of Transport, who found it impossible to earmark funds within a matter of several weeks to distribute colour pictures of the diagrams in the warning, because they had to create a source of funding for it. But anyway, they did send out a telex to Heathrow, and what the telex said was that these devices were built into commonplace things like tape recorders, which was true, and that those were very difficult to detect on X-ray, which was true. A tape recorder fitted up as one of these devices looked very like any other tape recorder on X-ray. And the letter, which was from the head of British Aviation Security of the day, who now lives on a full state pension, actually said to Heathrow in a telex, searchers should be aware that other devices such as this may be available, and where they come across a device about which they're uncertain, they should ensure it goes in the hold of the aircraft. You nod. In the hold of the aircraft was precisely where those devices were designed to be put. They required no human intervention on the plane whatsoever. That guy lived to complete his career and draws a full state pension. If he'd done his job properly, I don't think it would have made any difference, because I think probably the Lockerbie bomb came through a break-in, which was a different scenario. But the point that indicates, it just highlights how sloppy were the defences erected by the government of the day against an atrocity like this. And every single one of those warnings were ones that we obtained by back channels. None of them were volunteered by the government of the day. That particular one was volunteered to me by a chap who wrote a letter in the Times. This may be sort of anecdotally interesting. He wrote a letter in the Times in reply to a letter from me. I'd said I didn't think Heathrow security was up to very much, even though, of course, I didn't in those early days know anything about the break-in. And he wrote a letter saying, of course, Heathrow security wasn't so bad after all, blah, blah, blah. And Dr. Swire didn't know what he's talking about, which Dr. Swire didn't really at that stage. And anyway, to cut a long story short, the Times put us in touch with each other, and we met. It turned out the guy ran an intelligence bureau which was used by the Metropolitan Police and others. And he allowed me to borrow a copy of the German warning for 5 minutes. And it was very interesting because I photographed it on his fire escape, where he had an avocado tree. And on the front cover of this, it was a sunny day, and there was a shadow of one of the avocado leaves and the strap of my camera, because I was in a heck of a hurry to photograph it all. And to cut a long story short, with his permission, it came out worldwide in the media fairly soon after that. And there was the shadow of my camera strap and the avocado leaf. It was all had to be done through back channels. The government would not cooperate in the slightest, nor would they even meet us to discuss an inquiry. Does that answer your question, Tulsi?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sir, go ahead.
Luke Dog-Zoom. This is slightly breaking the rules that I know, but I would like to know what Kate actually thought of their very articulate responses. I know you're on the panel, I'm not speaking tonight, but I would like to know what you thought about their responses.
Kate, I invite you to answer, and perhaps also I think I would be interested to know what you thought after you interviewed Megrahi originally. While you're standing up, maybe you could progress to that.
I don't think this is the time and the place because it is complex, and this is something that comes up frequently with this entire incident. And I have been subsequently many times back to the country, and I've also spoken to a great number of people involved in this. All I will say is that I think what has been indicated from the speakers here has probably been the overall impression that I got, that what was being arranged was something which the Libyans could arrange, in other words, produce two people, and they were prepared to make whatever arrangements domestically to facilitate this. In other words, they got two people who were very minor, who were fairly low-paid people from ordinary families with no great influence. They were people who could be produced in order to send them off to trial without causing too many domestic problems. So I have to say, and it's a significant point now, that there is a sense still that amongst a number of Libyans, who of course live under a fairly propagandized regime domestically if they haven't got access to foreign language sources, that they feel an enormous concession was made by Colonel Gaddafi sending people to trial. So Gaddafi himself, and his people will tell you this, have a problem dealing with this, that they themselves aren't entirely in the clear with their own people. As for the reactions, I am just curious, because this is something which rumbles on, has immense ramifications about morality. I saw a very interesting article by a former senior politician, British politician, in the newspapers this week, which was the argument for realpolitik versus justice. And I think that that's probably where we are at the moment, that so much is at stake, and what has been said and done over the past couple of decades almost now, so much is at stake, that there are people who are very, very ready to argue, and I'm not including Oliver Miles here because he's acknowledged that there are all kinds of caveats, but it is the diplomatic view, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are times when realpolitik trumps justice. Am I right?
No, I wouldn't accept that.
Really? But I have heard that argument this week from a very senior politician, from two, in fact.
Well, some politicians may take that view, but I don't.
Yes, but would you say, oh, well, let me extend it. Would some politicians be of that mind?
Look, it's like any other walk of life. You have moral considerations, you have material considerations. You have to make your judgments as best you can. If you abandon your moral considerations, you're a crook.
I think we have a question here and one there, and our time is getting short. We have about 12 minutes left, so I'll take the two questions, and before we leave I would like to address a question to you and the others by extension. It's been mooted in the press that oil had something to do with the fact that Megrahi was sent back to Libya, and it was really all about enhancing the business climate so that Britain could ensure energy and petroleum supplies from Libya. I'd like to know what you think about that and how it may or may not have had any bearing on the deal you mentioned. But let's first deal with these questions. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, my name's Quinton Dealer. I just wanted to pick up a point made by Mr. Miles about why Mr. Megrahi might have accepted to become a fall guy. I think was the phrase he used, and it partly speaks also to a point that Kate Adie made. I just want to consider the ways that a regime like the Libyan regime might be able to influence the behaviour of its citizens. And I just wonder whether it's also the case, what would have happened to Mr. Megrahi had he not agreed with the directive of his government to go to stand trial. And so what would be interesting to know, it's a point that K80 made in talking about the way that the government was able to produce these two fairly minor individuals. Is there any evidence, for example, that their families were financially remunerated? Or is there any, for cooperating, is there any evidence that they were threatened with torture or imprisonment if they didn't cooperate? Is there any evidence that members of their families would have been imprisoned or killed if they didn't cooperate? So it's, and I'm just really trying to explain or understand why it was that an innocent person, let's assume that they were innocent, would become a fall guy.
You go ahead. And
okay. I don't think I used the expression fall guy, but okay, we'll accept that. I don't think one can answer those questions fully. I don't think any of us know. There's plenty of evidence that Megrahi's family were treated generously by the regime, particularly after he was convicted and after he started to serve his sentence in Scotland. They went to great lengths to make it possible for his family to be with him and so on. I would regard that as the normal Libyan way, actually. I would be astonished if they hadn't done that. As for suggestions that he might have been tortured or punished in some way if he hadn't agreed to do it, I really don't feel able to comment. It's clearly the Libyan regime has a bad record of torture and punishing people, and it can't be excluded, but I don't know of any evidence for it.
Do you have anything to add, Dr. Swire?
I don't think so. An interesting point, though, is why did Gaddafi agree to hand them over? I mean, did he have to pressurize them as part of that? But don't forget that Nelson Mandela interceded to try to persuade, they were quite good friends, to try to persuade Colonel Gaddafi to do this. And Nelson Mandela made a very important comment just when President Clinton and the late Robin Cook, who was then our Foreign Secretary, agreed that there was going to be a trial, there ought to be a trial. Nelson Mandela made a very important point. He said, no one country should be complainant, prosecutor, and judge. And Professor Robert Black, who was the instigator of the idea of a neutral country trial, had suggested a court in which there would be an international panel of judges. And that was overruled by the politicians and became a panel of Scottish judges, and of course there was no jury. I think Nelson Mandela made a very important statement when he said that.
Thank you. Yes, you have a question.
Yes, Deborah Arnott. I just wanted to pick up on...
Could you identify yourself?
Yes, Deborah Arnott is my name. I just wanted to pick up on something Jim Swire said, and I think journalists have been largely let off the hook tonight. And it's very nice having a cosy discussion here. But actually, what are journalists going to do about this? Because sadly, Paul Foot is dead. And human rights lawyers and activists like Jim Swire and our colleague in the middle actually need the support of journalists to keep this case going and actually in the media eye. And I remember the day that Megrahi was sent back, seeing an interview with you, Jim, on the television. I can't remember who the journalist was. And you made some very clear points. And the journalists didn't listen at all to what you said and just repeating the standard line that we heard on news report after news report. And unless there are journalists out here amongst you or elsewhere who are actually going to pick up on this and keep fighting this, how can human rights campaigners and lawyers and campaigners actually do it on their own? They need a free journalist who's actually going to make the effort to look at this and do something more about it.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say in reply to that I am intensely grateful to the media in general for the huge amount of support they've given to this story. I mean, for goodness sake, we're talking about what many people refer to as an incident occurring 20 years ago. And here we all are discussing details of that incident. If it hadn't been for people in the media, it would have faded into obscurity very many years ago. And they have been tremendously supportive, particularly north of the border, in doing that. It's just that I feel there is a slackness which should be taken up, whereby hard-hitting, hard-nosed journalists could probe into crevices that are now apparent, and I do hope and pray that they'll do that. I suspect that my son, to whom I've said, have a look at this when the 50 years come up, may be the one who finds out the truth about it, because there are so many secrecy provisions in our establishment. But you have done fantastically well in support of us. But it's just that I think we now lack the punch that people like Paul Foot had to actually investigate and think about what we're seeing. Do we believe it? Don't believe it? Okay, we can make this construct, that construct. Where does that take us? This is all part of investigative journalism. And I think in this country particularly, as what I'm saying really is, I can no longer trust the justice system, certainly in Scotland. In my heart, I feel that. If I can't trust justice, how can I get to the truth behind this dreadful business to which I have a right of access to, or should have a right of access to? Your all stands to help us to do that. So thanks very much so far. Let's try harder.
Can I follow up and ask you, what sort of impetus is there for some kind of inquiry or investigation coming from inside Scottish justice? Because they must feel that their credibility is on the line.
I couldn't. It's a very difficult one. Scotland is a relatively tiny country, and her legal profession is therefore even tinier. Everybody knows everybody, and there are relationships and friendships and all the rest of it. And then at the centre of it all is the Crown Office, and I have no way of knowing how far the tentacles of the Crown Office extend. I don't wish to demonise the Crown Office, but I think I referred earlier to trying to get something good to come out of something so evil. I think the more Alex Salmond and his ilk go down the road of seeking independence for Scotland, the more desperate is the need to ensure that the prosecuting authority can be trusted by the people, because a good judicial system should be the bulwark between ordinary people and in situations where their government may be doing things that they don't like. And if they don't have that, God help Scotland is all I can say.
Thank you. Now let's ask the $100 a barrel question to you. How much, in your view, did Megrahi being sent home have to do with British wanting oil?
Not much, I think, is the answer to that. First of all, yes, Libya is an important, not the most important, but an important oil producer. Sells its oil on the world market. Some of it is bought by Britain, not a huge amount, because in the past very little, because North Sea oil and Libyan oil are very similar in quality, so most of the oil was being bought by other European consumers. But really this is irrelevant, because the way that the oil business works is that oil producers put their oil onto the world market. Look at what's happening in Switzerland at the moment. Gaddafi has suddenly decided not to sell oil to Switzerland. He's cut off oil supplies to Switzerland. It doesn't make a ha'porth of difference, because the Swiss buy from somebody else, and Gaddafi sells to somebody else, and it goes on exactly as it was before, and the same refineries are producing almost exactly the same products as they were before. So the idea that you have to have that oil is somehow dominating the political scene, I think rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of the way the oil market works. Now, it's perfectly true that at the same time that the prisoner transfer agreement was being negotiated over the last 2 years, since Tony Blair's second visit to Libya in 2007, a number of other matters were being negotiated as well. One of them was the prisoner transfer agreement. One of them was a big deal for BP. BP is one of, I suppose, 3 super majors in the world, along with Shell and ExxonMobil. All 3 are needed by Libya. Libya wants to expand its oil production. The only way, they know perfectly well, the only way they can do that is by bringing in the international oil companies. Now, it's true that they could manage perhaps without BP. They could manage by having Shell and ExxonMobil. Wouldn't be as good, but they could get by. So they tried to use BP as a pressure point on the British. And we've had this from both sides. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi's son has said it. Peter Mandelson has said it. What they've said is every time there was a conversation at high level between the Libyans and the British, the matter of Megrahi was raised. And when they were talking about oil, the matter of Megrahi was raised. And when they were talking about anything else, the matter of Megrahi was raised. Does that mean that there was a deal? No, it does not mean that there was a deal. I think myself that the only real significance of this story, what we've been talking about tonight, to the oil business, is that it could have harmed BP, it could have harmed British interests in one way or another. It was quite possible, Gaddafi being Gaddafi, that he would have made good his threats. He did before, after all. He threw out BP from Libya in the 1970s. when it was an important part of Libya's oil industry. None of you will be able to remember why he threw out BP. He threw out BP because he disapproved of the British attitude to the Shah's takeover of 3 small islands in the Persian Gulf. So if he could do that in the 1970s, I suppose he could do it in the 2000s. But that's the downside. There was a risk, yes, there was a risk that our interests would be damaged. But the idea that there was a deal is completely different, and I don't accept it for a moment. I really challenge anybody to produce any evidence for it.
Do you think then that Mr. Megrahi was sent home in order to forestall any kind of an appeal?
That's a different question. Now we're talking about a deal relating to the question I raised at the beginning: why did Megrahi give up his appeal? Let me just, I don't want to get too complicated and technical, partly because you'll be bored and partly because I'll probably get it wrong. But there were 2 ways in which Megrahi could have been returned to Libya. One was under the prisoner transfer agreement. One was, as happened in fact, by the compassionate clause, if you like, in Scottish law. Under the first of those 2, under the prisoner transfer agreement, it was necessary that he should abandon his appeal and that the Crown should abandon their appeal against sentence. But that, I think, would have been perhaps relatively simple, although nothing is simple in Scottish law. It probably would have taken years. So in the end, since he was returned under the compassionate clause, there was no need for him to abandon his appeal. And the question arises, why did he abandon his appeal? And if you want to be a conspiracy theorist, you might also ask, why was it on the very same day that the Scottish government leaked the fact that he was going to be allowed to go back to Libya, and on the very same day he applied to the court to abandon his appeal? Somebody fixed it. Now, I'm not going to go further than that because I don't know. And as many people have pointed out, it couldn't have been the Scottish and British governments working together, because they hate each other so much that no such conspiracy would have survived for 5 minutes. It must have been one or the other, but which one, I'm afraid I can't tell you.
We've almost run out of time. You raise, I think, important questions in your comments that are an invitation to investigative journalists here to pursue. I want to thank you all very much indeed for coming and talking to our audience this evening. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. And I expect if you're free to stay around for a few minutes after our session finishes, people might like to come and speak to you individually. I hope that would be all right, would it? Mm-hmm. Thank you very much indeed. Good evening.